Hi everybody, so this is going to be the first video in a series on the respiratory systems. I don't know exactly at what increments I'm going to time these videos at. I think we're just going to have to play it by ear, but I want to make it so these videos are no more than 30 minutes a piece. My goal for this first video is to get through the entire upper respiratory system. All right, sorry about that. Just working on progressing through these slides. This is the first time I'm using an iPad to go over a PowerPoint presentation, but the benefit of doing this with an iPad is I can use my new Apple digital pencil to be able to annotate on the notes as I present them in real time. So here we go. The major function of the respiratory system is to supply the body, that is the tissue cells of the body, with O2, and then remove CO2, which is a byproduct of their cellular respiration. This function in its entirety is known as respiration, and respiration involves 4 different processes, which we're going to go over next. So the first process of respiration we're going to go over is ventilation, otherwise known as pulmonary ventilation, aka breathing. All right, so breathing is just the moving of air in and out of the lungs. Now, a lot of times people erroneously ascribe this function to the term respiration. But as we just said, respiration refers to the overall diffusion of oxygen and CO2 throughout the body so that the cells, the tissue cells of the body, receive oxygen, and then that the CO2 that these cells give off is ultimately eliminated from the body. That's what respiration is. So in a nutshell, respiration really involves the diffusion of oxygen and CO2, whereas ventilation specifically refers to the physical movement of air into and out of our lungs. All right, and in order for the air to get to our lungs, it has to go through a series of airways, which we're going to start learning about in this lecture and then continue on in the subsequent lecture. And by the same token, in order for air to get out of the lungs, it also has to go through these same airways. All right, so ventilation is the movement of this air through these airways into the lungs, and then from the lungs out into these airways, and then ultimately into the environment again. By the way, here, these 2 cartoons show the 2 basic processes of ventilation, which are inspiration, that means taking air into the lungs, and expiration, which is expelling air from the lungs. All right, so the next process we want to go over is external respiration. So external respiration is the process in which O2 diffuses from the lungs to the blood, and also by which CO2 diffuses from the blood to the lungs. And you can see this picture right here. We see this cluster of little spheres that almost look like they have yellow rubber bands surrounding them. These little spheres are called the alveoli, and you probably remember the alveoli as referenced in AP1. When you learned about the alveoli, that's when you were learning about simple squamous epithelium. So these alveoli are microscopic air sacs in the lungs, that is, they're filled with air. And when we inhale, we take more air into these microscopic air sacs and they puff out. Well, they play a critical role in facilitating this process of external respiration because they are completely surrounded by capillaries. And you can see here in this inset, all right, we have a capillary within this cluster of alveoli. Now, this is a artist's schematic. The messy truth of the matter is that each of these individual air sacs will have a capillary bed surrounding them. And what's happening is we have the deoxygenated blood, as is symbolized by the blue blood, ultimately coming in from our pulmonary arteries and derivatives thereof, right? And that blue blood, which is deoxygenated, travels through these capillaries surrounding each and every one of these millions of little microscopic air sacs called alveoli. And as the blood surrounds the alveoli, the oxygen in these alveoli goes into the blood. So by the time the blood is collected by the venules at the end of the capillary, that blood is now oxygenated, and that's why we see this transition of the blood from blue to purple to red. By the same token, that deoxygenated blood that comes into these capillaries is also high in CO2, and that CO2 is then going to leave the blood and go into the air sacs of the lungs. So that's what we mean when we say that the CO2 diffuses from the blood to the lungs. The CO2 is leaving this blood surrounding these air sacs and going into the air sacs. At the same time, the O2 in the air sacs is leaving the air sacs and going into the blood. So let's talk about transport of respiratory gases. Well, this comes back to the cardiovascular system, specifically our pulmonary and systemic circuits, which you guys reviewed ad nauseum from our last unit. So with the transport of gases, which occurs through the blood, right? O2 is transported from the lungs to the tissue cells of the body. All right, and so basically what happens is the oxygen, which you can see up here, which is entering the blood from the air sacs, right? This oxygenated blood that's being collected from these capillaries surrounding the air sacs is ultimately being routed into our 4 pulmonary veins, and those 4 pulmonary veins are going to take the blood back to the left atrium, and then the blood goes to the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta, and ultimately from all of these derivative arteries from the aorta to all different parts of the body. And then in this capillary bed right here, we have the representation of ultimately the delivery of that oxygen to the cells serviced by these capillaries. And we're going to go over that next. That's our 4th process of respiration. All right. But what we're going over here with the 3rd process of respiration is the total delivery of the oxygen from the capillaries surrounding the alveoli to the capillaries surrounding the tissue cells of the body by going first through our pulmonary circuit to the left side of the heart, and then from the left side of the heart through all of the derivative arteries contained within our systemic circuit. All right. At the same time, at the level of the tissues, we have lots of CO2 being produced by those cells as a byproduct of their cellular respiration. That CO2 is unloaded into the venous side of our systemic circuit, right, into that deoxygenated blood that is being collected from these capillaries that service the trillions of cells of the body. And that CO2 in this deoxygenated blood ultimately is rerouted throughout all the veins of our systemic circuit back to the right side of the heart, right? First goes into the right atrium and then into our right ventricle and then up through our pulmonary trunk, which splits into our right and left pulmonary arteries, delivering that high CO2 deoxygenated blood to our 2 lungs. And here we are back to this capillary bed, metaphorical capillary bed. In reality, it's surrounding each of the millions and millions of alveoli contained within the lungs. And this high CO2 blood relieves itself of its CO2, which leaves the blood and goes into these microscopic air sacs, the alveoli. And then finally, our 4th process of respiration is internal respiration, which I just intimated before. This involves the capillary beds, which service our trillions and trillions and trillions of body cells of our body. And like we said before, the story is right here is that oxygen is leaving the blood to enter these cells where it's then consumed, all right, as a reactant in cellular respiration. At the same time, cellular respiration results in the release of the CO2, which then gets unloaded into the blood, being siphoned away from the capillary through the venules. Right? And that CO2 then travels with the blood that's being siphoned away through all the venules and veins of our systemic circuit and ultimately goes back up to the right side of the heart. All right? So, but what we're talking about right here as far as internal respiration goes is just the unloading of O2 to the cells or onto the cells, and then the unloading of CO2 from the cells into the blood. So in this process, these gases have to cross the walls of the capillaries. So ultimately, the big picture here is respiration is completely coupled to both our cardiovascular and respiratory systems. The two are really tied together, and some might make a valid point that the two are really part of the same greater system, because they are so intimately involved with one another's roles. All right, so here's an overview of the anatomy of the respiratory system. So here we're going to start changing gears a little bit, and we're going to be talking about the different passageways that are going to convey the air ultimately to the lungs and then take the air away from the lungs during the process of ventilation. That is, the passageways that are going to participate in inspiration and expiration, taking the air to the lungs and then expelling the air out of the lungs. So right here we can see our nasal cavity. All right, this is this large cavity that is within and posterior to our nose. The openings to the nasal cavity are our nostrils, otherwise known as our external nares. At the back of our nasal cavity, we have two openings known as your posterior nasal apertures, otherwise known as your internal nares, which lead to our pharynx. All right, the pharynx is this funnel-shaped tube. You can kind of think about it as being like a garden hose, all right, that lays not only behind our nasal cavity, but also behind our oral cavity. This is our oral cavity right here that I'm outlining, and this where I'm writing the T is your tongue. Now, you guys probably remember this from AP1, that the oral cavity is separated by the nasal cavity by our palate. And the anterior part of our palate is reinforced by our palatine process of our maxilla and our palatine bones. And then the posterior aspect of the palate, that is this division, this floor, if you will, between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, is just reinforced by a skeletal muscle. All right, so this pharynx, or throat, if you will, lays posterior to the oral cavity and the nasal cavity. Right here we have our larynx. All right, our larynx is otherwise known as our voice box. All right, this is where our ability to speak, or phonation, ultimately arises from. So what's going to happen as far as the roles that these structures play in our respiratory system, air is going to come in through our nasal cavity, come in through our oral cavity, and then from these two structures it's going to go into our pharynx. All right, and then basically what happens is our pharynx then reaches a point where it gives way to or connects to our our larynx, our voice box, all right, and then the air is going to go through that voice box and into this large tube right here called the trachea. Now, the pharynx also posterior to these two structures, the larynx and the trachea, is also going to give rise to a structure that's not shown here, which is the esophagus. All right, so ultimately, the most inferior part of the pharynx, which we're going to talk about later, called your laryngopharynx, is also continuous with the esophagus. So the upper portion of our respiratory tract is actually shared with our digestive tract. And so you guys know that food goes into the oral cavity, right? And then is rerouted down in through the lower two portions of the pharynx and then into the esophagus. When we swallow, however, we block off the top of the larynx so that food cannot go into the larynx and the trachea. Only air is allowed in the larynx and the trachea. So once the air goes down to the bottom of the trachea, it then goes, or I don't want to say it has a decision to make because it's not like a sentient entity, but in any event, the air can go in two different directions, all right? In this branch point in which it branches into these two derivative tubes from the trachea is called the carina. In these two tubes that the trachea branches into are known as our primary bronchi. The singular is going to be bronchus because the actual leader line is only pointing to one individual bronchus here. And then the primary bronchi are going to split into secondary bronchi and then into tertiary bronchi. And so we're going to go over the architecture of that coming up in our next video. And then, of course, right here we have our right lung and our left lung, and it's enclosed by our rib cage. And then right here we have the diaphragm, which, as you probably know by now, separates our thoracic cavity, where our lungs, heart, and mediastinum are, from our abdominal pelvic cavity, which is going to be here and below. Ultimately, the diaphragm is the driving force of inspiration or inhalation, as we'll talk about later. So the respiratory system is broken up ultimately into two different zones. All right, you have a conducting zone, otherwise known as dead air space. These are basically just tubes or pipes, if you will. They're there just to convey the air. And then you have a respiratory zone. Well, the respiratory zone also involves these tube-like airways, but within the respiratory zone, you actually have the exchange of gases occurring. That is CO2 and O2. So remember, the all-encompassing term for the diffusion of CO2 and O2 throughout the body is respiration. So because you have the diffusion of these gases across the walls of the airways of the respiratory zone, we refer to these airways as being part of the respiratory zone. We refer to the airways of the conducting zone as such because there is no respiration going on. The only function of those airways is just to get the air from point A to point B. So now let's talk about the first or the most superior portion of the conducting zone. We just talked about this already, and this is our nose and nasal cavity. So the nose is the external part of our nasal cavity. It's basically composed of bone and cartilage and overlaid by skin. It basically encloses the entrance to the nasal cavity. The way that you get into the nasal cavity from the nose are from the external nares, aka nostrils. You also have internal nares. In the book, they're also known as your posterior nasal apertures. The term that I want you to know them as, however, are the internal nares. The internal nares are just the openings at the back of the nasal cavity that lead into the upper portion of the pharynx. Specifically, by the way, this upper portion of the pharynx is known as the nasopharynx. This area, by the way, is very, very vague. And you actually have two internal nares because, as you probably already know, the nasal cavity is split right down the middle in a mid-sagittal trajectory by the nasal septum. All right, so if you think about this in 3D, at the back of the nasal cavity, you're going to have two openings into the nasopharynx, all right, which is this first part of the pharynx right here, which I'm outlining by these hash marks going in the opposite direction. You're going to have two openings there because there's going to be one opening on either side of that central nasal septum. All right, and as you can see here in this diagram, here is our palate, which is going to be separating the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. You can see the bony reinforced part of the palate, which is known as our hard palate, and then posterior to the hard palate, you can see the skeletal muscle reinforced part of the palate, known as the soft palate. All right, so speaking of the nasal septum, we're looking at a frontal section of the nasal cavity right here, and you can see right here in the middle, this is our nasal septum. Our nasal septum is composed of the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, your vomer bone, and then septal cartilages as well. All right, it's more towards the back of the septum that you see the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone and the vomer bone, and more towards the anterior part of the nasal septum that you see the cartilage known as the septal cartilage. By the way, these structures we're going to go over coming up fairly soon. These scroll-shaped bones and bony structures facing medially, all right, extending from the lateral walls of the nasal cavity, are known as the konkey. So these are your inferior nasal conchae, which are actually considered to be their own bones. And then up here we see our middle nasal conchae, or konkey, I should say, is the way Americans pronounce it, are actually parts of your ethmoid bone, if you guys remember that from AP1. You also have superior nasal conchae, which are also part of your ethmoid bone, but they're so small, they're very difficult to appreciate. So, The vestibule is the first part of the most anterior part of our nasal cavity, which is enclosed by the nose. The vestibule is lined with little hairs, also known as the vibrissae, as you'll see in the textbook, but you can just know them as nasal hairs. That's fine with me. Very few people actually refer to them as the vibrissae. And the purpose of these hairs are just to catch really, really coarse particles of dust or other debris that may be within the air and to prevent it from going any further within inside of our body. Okay, so let's talk about the actual epithelial tissue and underlying basement membrane or connective tissue that lines this nasal cavity. All right, so throughout the nasal cavity, the tissue type is generally described as being the respiratory mucosa, and it's called mucosa because this epithelium has a lot of goblet cells in it. You can see one little goblet cell right here. And as you guys know, goblet cells make mucus, right? They're like little cups of mucus. In fact, goblet means cup. It's like a middle-aged word for cup or chalice. And these are chalices, if you will, filled with mucus, little cups of mucus, secreting the mucus out onto the surface of this epithelium. That's why we refer to it as mucosa. You also have lots of other glands which secrete mucus and serous fluid that are embedded within the connective tissues deep to the epithelial cells. By the way, just as a big overview, here is the epithelium right here, and I'm not going to get too close to these little hair-like structures called cilia because I don't want to block them off or obscure your view from them. But all of this right here is the epithelium. Right? And then everything deep to the epithelium is going to be the connective tissue basement membrane. Right? So again, it's here in this connective tissue basement membrane that we have lots of what are known as seromucous glands or glands which secrete both serous and serous fluid, that is, and mucus ultimately, which is ejected through ducts out onto the surface of this epithelium. So this mucus is important to help moisturize the air. It also helps trap particulate matter that may happen to be in the air. The apical surface of this epithelium has cilia. Histologically, the tissue cells are actually columnar in shape, and they're arranged in all different trajectories. And so when you put that whole picture together, you get what's known as pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. So this is an example of where we're going to find the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That's the definition, or that's how this epithelium is characterized. So again, we have the cilia on the apical surface, and the purpose of that cilia is to move that mucus, which is constantly trapping these dirt particles. And the direction in which the cilia move this mucus is back towards the back of the nasal cavity, so eventually it can be handed off to the nasal pharynx and eventually be pushed in the direction of our esophagus, which the entire pharynx ends up becoming continuous with inferiorly. Another thing that this mucus and serous fluid contains is an antibiotic enzyme known as lysozyme. And we make a tremendous amount of this mucus every day. We end up just swallowing most of it. We actually end up making about a liter or a quart of it every day, which is really hard to fathom. It's a tremendous amount of fluid, but most of it we just end up just swallowing, and then end up digesting it and recycling those resources. By the way, right here, this is a scanning electron micrograph of what this tissue looks like from its exterior. It kind of looks like a shag carpet. All these little bristles or hair-like structures are the cilia, which is beating the mucus in the direction towards the posterior aspect of the nasal cavity. And then every once in a while, these domed outcroppings are one of these goblet cells, which you can see over here in cross-section. All right, so as we said before, both the lateral walls of the nasal cavity are lined by these scroll-shaped bone-reinforced structures called the konkey. And we have 3 sets of konkey, all right, 2 on each side. So the inferior set are known as the inferior konkey, or konkey rather, I'm sorry. American pronunciation is konkey, even though it looks like it may be pronounced as konkey. And remember that they are reinforced by bones, also known as the inferior nasal konkey, which are in fact their own bones. Then you have the middle nasal konkey, and then finally the superior nasal konkey, which are so small and slight that you really can't appreciate them. The inferior grooves to these konkey, which kind of come out and form awning-like structures, are called the nasal meatai, the singular of which is going to be nasal meatus. So each individual nasal concha, which is the singular form of konkey, is going to have an associated nasal meatus, or inferior groove. Now what happens is as the air is sucked in through the nasal cavity as we inhale, the air basically spirals through these grooves, these nasal meatai, and that kind of sends the particulate matter flying in different directions, so it ultimately sticks to the mucus on the surface of the mucosa. So it's just kind of a clever way of ensuring that all that particulate matter ends up sticking to the mucosa. And it's so effective that by the time you reach the end of the nasal cavity, or specifically by the time the air reaches the end of the nasal cavity, you have particulate matter in the air that is no larger than 6 microns, all right, which is way smaller than what we can see with the naked eye. So it's extremely effective. So let's go over some of the functions of the nasal cavity. Because of all this mucus that we're secreting out onto the mucosa, that water in the mucus actually then gets evaporated into the air as it passes through the nasal cavity, and as a result, we're able to moisten the air. Now, because of the connective tissue basement membrane underlying the mucosa is so rich in blood vessels, as a result, as that air passes across this tissue, the air is warmed by the heat wafting away from these blood vessels. And at the same time, like we said before, because of all this mucus, this is a handy opportunity to trap particulate matter. And that cilia helps beat that mucus out of the nasal cavity, so ultimately it can be sent down our esophagus for digestion and elimination. So we also have paranasal sinuses associated with the nasal cavity. You guys remember learning about the paranasal sinuses in AP1. These are just these hollowed out cavities within our frontal bone, ethmoid bone, maxillary bones, and sphenoid bone. And you can see this picture right here showing all these different nasal sinuses that are highlighted with different colors. Remember, we have a similar model to this in the AP1 lab. It's like an allergist's model that basically just shows the same differentiation between the sinuses according to different colors and their relative distributions within the head. So ultimately, these hollow cavities are surrounded or enshrouded by mucosa, the same stuff that's surrounding the nasal cavity, and they have little tubes that connect them to the nasal cavity. So these paranasal sinuses are actually confluent with or connected to the nasal cavities. And by the way, they're thought to just help warm and moisten the air, much like the purpose of the nasal cavity itself. They may also act as resonance chambers that help project our speech as well. So you can read more about that in the book. So now what I want to switch over to is the pharynx. All right, so the pharynx is also known as the throat. In the upper portion or more superior portion of the pharynx is known as your nasopharynx. And your nasopharynx is that part of the pharynx which is immediately posterior to your nasal cavity. So here I really wanted to emphasize the language because you guys can go back and look at pictures like the picture I have for the diagramming more towards the end of the notes here, and kind of come to a visual spatial understanding of this on your own. But I really wanted to devote the real estate here on these slides to the language. But over here I do have an abbreviated inset of one of the diagrams that we have in the book, in which I show in the notes over and over again, that just centers in on the regions that you need to focus in for what we're talking about. So all of this, which I'm about to outline for you right here, is our pharynx. All right. So this is all going to be the pharynx. And actually, it does not include the entire pharynx, but it includes most of the pharynx. All right. Actually, I draw the line like that. There we go. So this is all pharynx right here. This is all pharynx. So again, the pharynx is this funnel-shaped tube bound by mucosa that lays posterior to your nasal cavity. This is the nasal cavity right here, and your oral cavity. OC, not OR. Your oral cavity right here. This is the beginning of your tongue. This is the root of your tongue. And this little flap of cartilage right here is your epiglottis, which is the little flap of cartilage that shuts to prevent food from going down into your larynx. So down here, it's not really shown, but this is going to be where your larynx is. And if you keep on going down here, this is going to be where your esophagus is. All right? So this basically shows the entire boundaries of the pharynx. So we're talking about the upper portion of the pharynx, which is all that portion of the pharynx which lays superior to your soft palate. So right here, this is your soft palate, all right? This is only the skeletal muscle reinforced part of your palate. Your hard palate is going to be further over here outside the bounds of the screen. So again, the nasopharynx is just this part of the pharynx which lays superior to this soft palate, all right? And which also lays immediately posterior to the nasal cavity. So within the nasopharynx, at the most superior and posterior aspects, you have mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, specifically tonsils, known as your pharyngeal tonsils, otherwise known as your adenoid tonsils. The term adenoid is better applied, however, to the clinical situation in which these tonsils become inflamed. You also have your openings to your eustachian tubes on either side of the lateral walls of the nasopharynx, all right? Your eustachian tubes are these very, very narrow tubes that ultimately lead to your middle ear cavity. Guys, remember the middle ear cavities are embedded within that rocky or petrous portion of your temporal bones of your skull. And then also the tissue type that you see throughout the nasopharynx is the same as which you find in the nasal cavity. It's of the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and the purpose for having the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium here is the same as it was with the nasal cavity. We're continuing to trap particulate matter and move that mucus, which is trapping that particulate matter, in the direction of down towards the esophagus so that that stuff can be swallowed and digested and reabsorbed and recycled. All right, so the middle portion of the pharynx is known as your oropharynx. So the oropharynx is inferior to your soft palate, but it's actually going to end when you get to the tip of your epiglottis. So remember, here's the epiglottis. This is this little flap of cartilage-reinforced mucosa that basically covers the top of your larynx. So right here, this is the larynx. Right? You probably can't read the writing, but you can see what I'm pointing out to you right here. I got to work on my precision with using this new pen. But this is going to be our larynx, and this little cartilage-reinforced cap on top of the larynx is your epiglottis. By the way, guys, this opening to the larynx, all right, from the pharynx is known as your glottis. So this cap that sits on top of the glottis and closes the glottis off when we swallow is known as the epiglottis because the prefix epi means on top of. So this is the flap that's on top of the glottis or covers the glottis. But in any event, the main show here is the oropharynx. So the oropharynx is this stretch of the pharynx which is right in the middle of the pharynx, and it's between, all right, the soft palate, all right, which ends posteriorly as this little pendulous portion called the uvula, right, and the very tip of the epiglottis. So it's just this short little region right here of the pharynx that we refer to as the oropharynx. All right, so when the doctor or nurse practitioner asks you to open up your mouth, stick out your tongue, and say, ah, and they say that they're examining your throat. This is the portion of the throat that they're actually looking at, is your oral pharynx. So it's just a very, very short stretch of the pharynx. However, there's some important structures that you can see here. On the lateral walls of the pharynx, you can see your palatine tonsils on either side. You also have a large lingual tonsil that's embedded in the root of the tongue, all right, which is basically making up the anterior wall of this particular part of the pharynx. All right. By the way, this division between the oral cavity, OCL abbreviated as, and the oral pharynx, it's kind of a vague opening, all right, much like the posterior nares are a vague opening, but this arch-shaped division, all right, or arched reinforced opening that's between the oral cavity and the oral pharynx is known as the isthmus of the fauces. Isthmus of the fauces. Fauces, by the way, is just another word for throat. Isthmus basically means bridge. It roughly translates in Greek to bridge. Not really, but good enough for our purposes. It's actually not a particularly good term for what it's being used here for, if you want to look at its literal translation. But when I see isthmus, the first thing that pops into my mind is bridge, and it works. It always helps you understand what the structure is from an anatomical standpoint. So basically, this opening is the bridge between the oral cavity and the oral pharynx. And again, it's just a vague opening that's encircled by this arch-shaped structure that's reinforced ultimately by different types of muscles that help us swallow. Okay. So we just talked about the lingual tonsils. By the way, lingual equals tongue. That's why we refer to them as the lingual tonsils. They are the tonsils at the root of our tongue. By the way, the tissue type that you see throughout the oral pharynx is stratified squamous epithelium. So we're now transitioning from the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium that we found in the nasopharynx to this more rugged stratified squamous epithelium. And that's because this part of the pharynx is designed to not only take in air, but also to receive food, because food is coming in through the oral cavity and then being routed by the tongue back through the isthmus of the fauces and into the oral pharynx, and then ultimately down into the esophagus, all right, which is starting right about there. So that's why we have to have cells that are more rugged to be able to deal with the friction and the chemical insult that goes along with taking in food. If we had cilia there, the cilia would just be ground away and there wouldn't even have any purpose for even trying to grow them there. All right, so let's talk about the laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx is just a short little inferior stretch of the pharynx. All right, it's basically the part of the pharynx that lays immediately posterior to the glottis, which is the opening of the larynx. So this right here, this whole structure that I'm outlining in red, is our larynx. Let's see if I can draw this a little bit better. Larynx, all right? So as I said before, this is the epiglottis, this cartilage-reinforced flap that closes the larynx when we swallow, so food just goes directly down into the esophagus. This stretch of the pharynx that lays posterior to the larynx is called the laryngopharynx. The tissue type here, again, is stratified squamous epithelium because, like the oral pharynx, this is a conduit, all right, for food. And again, like I just said before, it's at the inferior aspect of the laryngopharynx that you see the division between the respiratory tract and the digestive tracts. Where the laryngopharynx is continuous with the esophagus, this is where we see the beginning of the digestive system, all right? And then where the laryngopharynx gives way via the glottis into the larynx, this is the beginning of our lower respiratory tract. By the way, when we talk about upper respiratory tract versus lower respiratory tract, the upper respiratory tract are all these passages that we just talked about, your oral cavity, your nasal cavity, your nasopharynx, your oral pharynx, your laryngopharynx, right, that are carrying air above the level of the larynx. But once we get to the larynx and all of the different air passages derived from that point, we are in our lower respiratory tract. All right, so let's talk about the larynx in a little bit more detail, and I think that's just going to be the end of this lecture. So the larynx is also known as the voice box. It has quite an elaborate reinforcement of structures. Ultimately, it's connected to and suspended from the hyoid bone. You guys recognize the hyoid bone right here? Only bone in the body which is not connected to another bone, right? So you can see basically inferior to this hyoid bone, we have all the cartilaginous reinforcements of our larynx. So there's 9 different pieces of cartilage that are connected together by different membranes and ligaments that basically compose this voice box. Right out in front, we have the very prominent shield-shaped cartilage called your thyroid cartilage. It's called the thyroid cartilage because right about here and right about here you have your lateral lobes of your thyroid gland. In males, the laryngeal prominence, this flared out portion, anterior, or I should say the flared out anterior portion of the thyroid cartilage is especially pronounced, and the slang term for that is the Adam's apple. It's important that you know that this piece of cartilage is only in the front of the larynx. While it's very broad and impressive in the front, it actually comes to an abrupt end. You don't find it in the back of the larynx. Now, I just wanted to point this out before we go further. Just inferior to the thyroid cartilage, this ring-shaped cartilage, and by the way, I want you to take note of the word that I just used to describe this ring shape. This actually does encircle the entire perimeter of the larynx. This is your cricoid cartilage. So your, not laryngeal, but your thyroid cartilage basically sits on top of your cricoid cartilage, which actually rings around the entire perimeter of the larynx. Now, let's look at that cricoid cartilage from a side view. This is the cricoid cartilage. Looking from a side view, or this is really a mid-sagittal view, so it's like we cut down the larynx in half and we're looking at it from one side. And you can see that while the cricoid cartilage is very short in the front, this is the anterior portion of the larynx, it's very tall in the back. This is the posterior aspect of the larynx right here. So despite the fact that it's shaped like a ring, it's kind of an asymmetrical ring, all right? So it's much shorter in the front and then much taller in the back. And then right here, what we're showing, or it's not right there, skip that, I'm sorry, but this right here, right, is all going to be your thyroid cartilage, all right? By the way, this little cartilage reinforced flap right here is going to be our epiglottis, right? So altogether, the 3 cartilages we just reviewed are the largest cartilages, also known as unpaired cartilages of the larynx because they are not paired. That's why they're called unpaired cartilages, are the cricoid cartilage, thyroid cartilage, and epiglottis. Now, we also have paired cartilages. We actually have 3 pairs of these paired cartilages for a grand total of 6. And they are called paired because you have 2 identical sets on either side, and they sit perched basically upon either side of the back of this very tall portion of the cricoid cartilage. Right? So here they are. Their shapes are complex. We don't really emphasize them in lab. I do want you to know about the most inferior set of these cartilages, which rest immediately upon this cricoid cartilage. And these are known as the arytenoid cartilages, the retinoid cartilages. So they're pyramid-shaped cartilages, and their job is to anchor your vocal cords, your true vocal cords, also known as your vocal folds, all right? And as you probably know, these vocal cords vibrate due to the muscles that are attached to these arytenoid cartilages and the other paired cartilages as well. And these muscles pull on these cartilages, and then the retinoids pull on the vocal cords, and the vibrations that are created from this movement are imbibed into the air that's passing through the larynx, all right? And that's basically responsible for the phenomenon of phonation, or putting vibrations into the air that passes through the larynx, all right? And that's the very beginning of our ability to speak. Now, most of what's responsible for us being able to enunciate certain words is the complex interaction between the muscles of our pharynx and our tongue. However, the initial vibrations that we need in order to project those manipulations, all right, starts here with the vocal cords. Again, we said the epiglottis is just this cartilage-reinforced flap. Specifically, it is elastic cartilage, which makes it unique. That basically sits as a cap on top of the larynx. The opening to the larynx is called the glottis. The epiglottis is called the epiglottis because it sits atop of the glottis. Epi means on top of. And basically what happens is when we swallow, the epiglottis snaps shut, closes off the glottis, and prevents food from going down into our lower airways. So again, let's go over the vocal cords. We have a set of true vocal cords, which actually imbibe vibrations into the air. But sitting on top of our true vocal cords, we have these flaps of mucosa that basically protect our true vocal cords, called our false vocal cords. Now, if you want to use the alternative language, you can also call our true vocal cords vocal folds, in which case you would refer to your false vocal cords as the vestibular folds. For me, I think it's just easier to remember that your true vocal cords are, in fact, your true vocal cords, and your false vocal cords are those flaps of mucosa that sit over them and protect them. And again, the vocal cords surround the glottis, which is the opening to the larynx, which the epiglottis is designed to shut off when we swallow. So here's looking at some of these structures from one of these Merriam coloring book diagrams. Here you can see the hyoid bone, which is basically you have your thyroid cartilage suspended through these ligaments, and then sitting inferior to the thyroid cartilage, here's the anterior portion of your cricoid cartilage, and then sneaking up behind here, this tongue-shaped mucosa covered cartilage is your epiglottis. All right, so the next part we're going to go over is the trachea, and I think I'm going to cut off this video here and pick up with the trachea a little bit later. So I will talk to you soon.